You can see we're getting to a critical mass. So let me start now
Okay.
and welcome you. I'm Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. Hope everybody had a good and productive and healthy and safe summer. And I'm glad that we're starting up our webinar series again this fall. And I'm very excited to have Robert Tynes um, be our first presenter. Um, Robert is a colleague. I'll give you a little bit of his bio, which I shared uh, via email, but I want to tell you a little bit more about it. His bio is he's a political scientist who researches political violence, child soldiers, hate movements, online activism, college and prison programs, and African politics. His book, Tools of War, Tools of State, examines the modern use of children in war. He's director of research and site director of the Bard Prison Initiative at Bard College. If you don't know about the Bard Prison Initiative, email me or look online. I encourage you to learn more about it. It's really an amazing program started by a Bard student a couple of decades ago named Max Kenner, and it's dedicated to the proposition of the importance of education for people who are incarcerated. And just the results of that program on so many levels is really astounding. And Robert is a big part of why it's been a great success. I want to say something else about Robert before I introduce him fully and let him start speaking about his report. When I started the Center for the Study of Hate at Bard, one of the first things I did was I reached out to faculty members who might be interested to pick their brains about what they needed, what the center should be, what it could do. And Robert was one of the first people that came forward and was part of some of the meetings to discuss this. And the report is a result of part of the direction that he was encouraging us to go. But I fished out an old email. I didn't tell Robert I was going to do this, but uh, just how prescient it is. One of the early emails, we were talking back and forth about what we could do. This is March 26, 2019. He said, right now I'm working on a project analyzing Gavin MacLeod's use of social media to mobilize and manipulate white males, especially the Proud Boys. I'm concerned with what are the rhetorical strategies that McInnes and his crew employ online. Is it fascist politics sparking violence? Or is it, as McInnes claims, just joking around? This is, almost 2 years before the Capitol insurrection. This report on McInnes and the Proud Boys, I think, is must reading. So I encourage you to do that too. But I want to talk about the project that I did for the center, which is our first publication. There will be more coming down the pike, supported by a generous grant from the PS Humane Corporation. And it's a unique way of looking at hate. We tend to look at hate as siloed things, hate crimes or legislation or whatever. And Robert pulled together a variety of metrics so that we could look at hate in a wider lens in different geographic areas to sort of see what the state of hate is. That's why it's a state of hate index. We anticipate that this won't be the last one, it's just the first one. And I think it's an opening to thinking about these issues more widely, and we hope that others will follow his model. So with that introduction, I'm gonna disappear and Robert's gonna speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll do Q&A. I encourage you, if you want to throw in a question, just put it in the Q&A box. I will moderate at the end. I'll remind people to submit questions, but you don't have to wait to the end to put them in the box. Anyway, Robert, welcome. I'm delighted to have you with us.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. I did not know that you were going to bring up the Gavin McInnes, but I'm, of course, pleased that you did. I'm going to screen share. First of all, thank you, everybody, for coming. I know it's kind of odd. I've asked you to come and sit for about an hour and talk about hate, and I know that's not an easy subject, so I really appreciate that. As Ken said, this really started 2 years ago in these reading groups, and they kind of had the idea as a political scientist that I had not seen any sort of kind of comprehensive index. You know, in political science, there's a lot of different types of indices, and I hadn't seen anything for hate. And I thought, oh, this might be a good idea to do. And I asked Ken, and he said, sure, go for it. So this is the results, really, of 2 years of work. And you know, it's 2 years not that I did myself. I had lots of support, and I want this is my thank you page for all those people who's helped me over these 2 years. Certainly, the Bard Center for the Study of Hate um, gave me sponsorship all through. As Ken mentioned, GS Humane Corporation. I had research help from Hannah Henry, and then Ken all along gave me great feedback. Others helped read early drafts. Kathy, Kristen, Jack were extremely generous. Again, you know, I asked them to read about hate, think about hate, and they jumped right in. I wanted to thank Maria Simpson, who gave great editing. She read through the manuscript several times and did wonderful feedback. And then finally, the publication. If you look on Ken's website for the Bard Center of Study of Hate, there is a PDF of this report in detail. And that is in a large part due to the fact of help from Mary Smith, Leslie, and I wanted to thank them all. All right, so generally, what is this? The State of Hate Index. It's really just an initial sketch. I'm not saying that this is it. I wanted to start to dig in and see what the potential for hate-based violence was in a given region. We did it regionally. And I'm mostly concerned with how hate manifests and is constrained as well, both sides of it. Now, the idea for it, I like to use the parallel. My wife and I used to drive across the country many, many times, like all the way across the country. So seeing numerous states. And every time I passed into a new state, I wondered, you know, what is it going to be like? Is it going to be different? And generally, I felt like there was a field, almost a cultural difference, if not just a social difference. And when thinking about hate, I kind of attached on this idea of such as Victor Hugo Green's Negro Motorist Green Book, the idea that are there places where you go to and you feel safer or it is safer, and there are other places where you should really kind of steer around. There's a similar guide in the 30 for Jewish travelers in the Catskill Mountains of New York. And so this is the general idea. All right, so hate. How do I define hate? Ken Stern has a great definition, which I agree with here. It's the human capacity to define and then dehumanize or demonize another. So it's more than just the human capacity to define an other. We see that in all sorts of shades, sometimes good, sometimes bad. But hate really is pushing that othering into dehumanization or demonizing someone. Now, for the State of Hate Index, the implications are when you cross the state line, you know, does it have the potential to humanize or dehumanize you, to actually determine if you should or should not exist? Now, the common statistic out there in popular culture that's used, and Ken mentioned it, are FBI hate crime statistics, which is, you know, they collect them every year. It's a huge database. It's very comprehensive. It's also the most popular measure. Now, the problem with this, though, and this is not my take on it, other researchers have looked at this, is state self-report. So what you find is at times underreporting or underclassification. Depending on what's going on at the local police station, it might not get reported. Or it might be classified not as a hate crime, but just as a crime. And this also happens, you know, what the local DA is willing to do. So I thought, well, what's going on? What's going on here? And how can I start to measure it or build a model? And I was looking around, and ideally, it would be great to get a 10-year grant to go out state by state and collect data on this, but I don't have that grant right now. So what I did do is I looked around to see what data was already out there, what databases on hate. Not only what databases on hate or violence, but what were ones that looked at it at a state level. And so the data that I've used here is drawn from organizations and social scientists who do this, who track various aspects of discrimination and hate. So Southern Poverty Law Center, Anti-Defamation League, Human Rights Campaign, Lebanon and Nakashima, Gurney and Parsons are some researchers who do this as well. Again, I want to reiterate this. This is just an initial step towards a deeper understanding what might be happening state to state. I want others to pick this up and use this as a grounding and go deeper into the research. I think it's a solid place to start from, so that's why I have it out here. Also, as we go along here, I'm giving you kind of the highlights. I want you to go, if you're really, really interested in this, go to Ken's website, find the PDF, and really go deeper into it, because it is much more detailed than what I'm going to give you here. But I wanted to get kind of the conversation started. All right, so when I was out there looking through all these databases, I started to kind of develop a theoretical idea for this. Not thinking about hate as an emotion, but this hate is this action, and that hate is this action also creates certain fields. And I'm really borrowing from the sociologist Bourdieu. I won't go into that deep theory here, but he really talks in terms of fields of social forces, fields of practices, and then habitus, which is really when these kind of practices become embodied. So I split this up, looking at the measures, into two angles or dimensions. The first is embodiment. And this is really concerned with measuring kind of actions in groups. So I'm looking at people who promote and actually act on hate, but also those who receive the hate, the ones who are potentially dehumanized. And then the other dimension of this is structure, looking at laws and policies. And I know this is abstract, but it'll be a little more clear coming up. So embodiment. For embodiment, 4 different measures here. So I looked at a database from the Southern Poverty Law Center that was hate groups by state. I looked at research by Smith and others, which gave a database for violence against women. I look at the Anti-Defamation League's anti-Semitic violence tally, and then also the ADL's white supremacy violence tally. They're very, all these groups are very good at collecting data on a state level. And then the other part of this is structure, right? So Lebanon and Nakashima have general laws and policies that they track this state by state. And then the Human Rights Campaign has laws and policies pertinent to LGBTQ. And then finally, Gurney and Parsons, they collect laws on guns and domestic violence. And this last one really pertains to hate against women. All right, so what did I just say? Here it is grouped all together. So the measurements by categories. Again, embodiment, number of hate groups, violence against women, anti-Semitic violence, and white supremacy violence. And then the other side, the structure field part, general laws and policies for LGBTQ, and then guns and domestic violence policies. Now the index itself, this is more into the construction. It really spans from 2010 to 2020. Now, that doesn't mean all the data falls within that, because I had to kind of make the best model with some of this data does not go back to 2010, but I wanted to get as much data as possible so that we could kind of semi-forecast what would happen in 2021 and on. Now, I found the most accurate recent data as possible. States are ranked for each individual measure, all right? This includes the District of Columbia. Now, the reason why I put District of Columbia, certainly, with its push towards statehood recently helps, but it's also included in all these databases as significant when it comes to hate. Now, I rank from 1 to 51. District of Columbia is the 51st. A low rank, and I'll go over this again when I pull up the chart, a low rank means there's the least hate potential. So if you get a 1, that's really the least hate potential. And then a high rank, 51, has the most hate potential. And we're really talking about not hate as an emotion, but kind of this idea of potential for hate-based violence. I took the total of all these rankings for the state and then came up with an overall rank. And then the result, again, is the ranking of potential for hate-based violence in a state compared to other states. And this last part, compared to other states, I think is important because you could potentially be 51 and have really low measures of hate. However, compared to the other states, you're at the bottom. Okay, here's the index. And notice, because there's 51, I could not fit it all in the screen. So I cut off, that doesn't negate the center. I think that's just as important. But for the purposes of this, what I've done is giving you the top 10 and then the bottom 10. So remember, here, we've got the states and then we've got the rank. The rank means, number one, this is the least potential for hate-based violence. All right. And then these are all the 7 measures here. Number of hate groups, violence, anti-Semitic violence, white supremacy. Remember, if we go back, these are the embodiment measures. And then these 3 here are the structure, laws, and policies. So these are ranked within those measures. And then the total is right here, 63, which gives this one. So I'm sure everybody's just kind of gone right onto here. New York. New York is number 1. Hawaii, Illinois, California, Connecticut, New Jersey, Maryland, Massachusetts, Florida, and Delaware. And Florida, I think, is important here because certainly in the press and from what we've seen recently, I don't think intuitively I would have thought of Florida as being there. But note that all these calculations take place before DeSantis and kind of where the government bodies kind of came down much harder than they have in the past. All right, so from the bottom up, Idaho is unfortunately at the very bottom, right? Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, Arkansas, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Nebraska, Alaska, and North Dakota. So one other important thing here, let's look at North Dakota, okay? They're in the bottom 10. Number of hate groups, right? This is per capita as well. It ranks 38, right? But violence against women, it ranks 3rd, which is pretty darn good, right? It's right up there. Let's see, women 19 is better than New York. However, the cumulative of all these measures adds up and makes it 41st. Okay, I know you probably can't read the individual states, and this is why it's color coded. But what this is looking at the rankings by region to see if there was any regional difference here. And so blue is northeast, east. These are the bluish colors, right? Kind of the reds and the greens. The reds are the south. That's what the S stands for. And the green is the W. So there's a little bit of a leaning on the east coast to the northeast and a little bit of the south and the west. There's somewhat of a pattern. It's not definitive. Again, this is just an initial start. All right. But if we look at state rankings by political party, right? So we're looking at, I took a measure for state and legislative partisan composition, and this is not my data, this was drawn from elsewhere, right? Blue is Democrat, red is Republican. So there clearly is, at the bottom here, Republican partisan bias here. Idaho, Montana, all these, and all the red. So I think that's interesting and definitely should be looked at more. Now, the other part I did here is I divided it up and ranked just according to embodiment, right? What happens on the ground to people versus structure, what the laws and policies are. And so New York actually does not come up on top for embodiment. Hawaii does, but New York is up there in 4. Look at Florida though. Very little actually what happens on the ground bad. And this is really what keeps it up in the top 10. But 27th, you know, about the middle when it comes to laws and policies. Now, hopefully what will happen is in the next year, I'll be able to gather more data on laws and policies and see what's changed from the voting rights, anti-voting rights to anti-choice, and see, you know, will Florida actually sink much lower because of that? All right. So because I'm a political scientist, certainly, you know, I think in terms of statistical analysis, because the top is really just a ranking and an adding, right? But I wanted to do kind of a linear regression using some of this and look to see what maybe some correlations might be developing here. And so my dependent variable, or what I'm trying to explain is, right, the raw score for rank. And my independent variables, things that I think might lead to like either an increase in hate-based violence or a decrease, are income inequality, poverty, unemployment, and urbanization. And these are not what I did not make these up. These are drawn from other studies and other hate-based studies. So what did I find? Well, urbanization shows an extremely strong correlation, 99.9%. And so what this means is, as a state becomes more and more urbanized, it's less likely to have hate-based violence. So I'll say that again. As urbanization increases for the state, hate-based violence potential, the likelihood of, again, this is not a set in stone. We're talking about statistics, so it's probability. The likelihood decreases. Income inequality also shows a strong correlation. And what this was measured by for the Gini index. So as there's a greater disparity between the classes, as the middle class starts to dissolve and you get like a polarized lower class and a polarized upper class, right? The potential for hate-based violence increases. The other thing I did just to see, I put in hate-based, the FBI hate crimes, to see if there was any correlation to these rankings, and there's none at all. All right, so what does that tell us? What do we need? Well, this is a first glimpse. So we definitely need more refinement of existing databases out there and more collecting of data of underrepresented groups. I would have happily put in more information. There's a little bit in there of Asian Americans, Latinx, Muslim Americans, and Arab Americans, but there's really not at the state level a lot of information out there. For Asian Americans, there's a coalition to stop AAPI, which is doing a great job at collecting data. And I hope to, over the next year or so, to incorporate their data that they've pulled out. And then the other part here, which I think really matters, what states can do, is I think there needs to be more work on policies and laws that protect people who are discriminated against. A lot of times we see laws enacted, but they're doing the opposite of what we think should happen in democracy. They're actually excluding people. And I think I see that when I look, do deeper dives into kind of the laws and policies. So we really need to get legislators to work on this, because that reinforces the norm of equality for everyone, right? So at the very bottom level, what a law or policy does is it upholds a norm, a social norm that's important. And that's it basically for what I have now. Again, if you have more that you want to explore, pull up the PDF and look deep, because it's much more extensive than what I've presented here. This is my photo credits page. Unfortunately, I have not been to all these protests, but other people through the Creative Commons have contributed their photos to this. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that. And I do encourage people to download the report, to look at it closely, and to think about its implications. I see there are a couple of questions, but I presume others have more. So I encourage people to just type in the Q&A box, and I will moderate and ask those questions. But before we do, I wanted to raise a couple of things. I agree with you, Robert, about the need for the other type of data to grow this, and the things that we're seeing in politics at the moment, about voting rights and abortion rights and other things, I think could be an interesting part of this metric in the future, to see the direction that we're going from one year to the next. In case anybody's curious, I looked while you were speaking. Texas was number 19. I have a feeling like Florida, if you put some of these metrics in, it won't be 19 next time. I want to mention a couple of other things. One is that the report is, as we, at the center want to do, is not just to have academics think about these things more and to generate more research, although that's incredibly important. We also want it to have a real world impact. And I'm delighted that since we set this out, with the help of the BARD PR office and others as well, there has been some pickup. Just the other day, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and an email blast that included a subset of this and a notice of it and a link to it. So that's very good. And the other thing I would mention as well is in terms of utility. as I mentioned at the beginning, that this is just the first of the center's publications. The Wachs Family Foundation, Buffy Wachs, graciously underwrote something that should come out in the next few months, which is a community organizing manual for groups that want to focus on how do you deal with hate in your community, whether it's anti-Semitic hate or racist hate or anti-LGBTQ hate, so forth. And I shared this with a number of those folks that we're consulting to make sure that that manual is as useful as possible. And I think this will be a great tool for them to think about what other statistics they need in their state, how else to lobby for changes in laws. So it's not just, for those of us who are interested in reading and listening to these things, I have a practical implication on the ground. I will just share, without naming names, of one of the people that I spoke to in Montana about this and shared it with, and he looked at it and he said, A, he wasn't surprised where Montana was, and B, yet again, he's glad that Montana came ahead of Idaho. So, so it's generating some discussion. And one other thing before I go to the questions that I'd like you to respond to, because you and I have been sort of chit-chatting about this the last week or two. I wonder, even though we're looking at hatred from that definition that you're putting into the data, we've seen other things lately that raise questions. For example, Montana and Idaho have both been in the news lately because they're rationing care in northern Idaho and parts of Montana because of COVID. And if you see why, there was an article that came out from a Kalispell paper a couple of days ago that was really chilling. It reminded me of the 1990s militia movements, where there were folks associated with hate groups that were threatening public officials, public health officials, for mask mandates, for so forth, and that these folks are resigning. So it's not just somebody going to be comfortable crossing a border. I think the implications of this data suggest that there are much wider implications, including for things like public health. So I just wanted to get your comment on that, and I'll take people's questions.
Yeah, I think especially now, part of why I frame it as the potential is, depending on what the climate is, we're certainly in a more extreme climate. All this data is really coming before COVID. And I think that what happens, as everybody knows, when COVID kind of hits, things become more intense, more extreme. It raises the stakes for everybody. And I think that's really what happens to these hate groups. There's more at stake for them, and they see an opening. And I think whether it's public health or I'm sure there's going to be other issues that this comes up. But this is why I think it's important to start to really get an idea of what's going on is the general environment, more than just like looking at individual hate groups. I think going deep dive into individual hate groups is great, but an individual hate group that steps into an arena that's extremely friendly to everybody has less power than when everybody's kind of scurrying and having a hard time with kind of community-based help. I think it's much easier for a hate group to act in that environment. So, and unfortunately, I think it has the potential to affect a lot more.
Thank you. So let me turn to the questions that people ask. I encourage you to keep asking questions. First one is, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about hate crime legislation. In Washington State, there's been a recent pushback from the Progressive Caucus around hate crime legislation because they believe any empowerment of law enforcement or prosecutors will be down unfairly on people of color, even in hate crime enforcement. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I first of all, I have to say, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a political scientist, so this is more of my opinion than my kind of studied analysis. But actually, having lived in Seattle for a good long time, I kind of understand the environment there, and I think that is important, right? It shows it's complex. It's not just, I'm not saying just pass laws, right? The kind of laws that I'm getting, first of all, that what you're referring to are very much enforcement and punishment laws, right? So it's protecting by punishing others. And as you bring up, are the punishers, right? Are they actually, do they have their own biases here? So that's, I think that is problematic. I think looking at laws and policies that kind of open up and create more freedoms or equalities. So, I think certainly this kind of what I'm calling the anti-voting rights movement of passing laws are creating laws that close down, that actually tend to punish people. And I think that's the wrong way to go. And I think that's part of what's going there. But like I said, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the nuances of that. But I would have to say, yeah, it's complicated. You're pointing out a huge complication that the progressives have kind of put their finger on.
Thank you. This is an easy question that I can answer. Where can you download the report? Everybody who registered will get an email tomorrow with a link to it. But if you want to go today, just go to the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. So bard.bcsh.edu, or actually the other way, bcsh.bard.edu, and there's a publications tab. And if you click that, you'll see a link to the report, but you'll get it automatically tomorrow. A question from a colleague of ours who works on communications, media, and so forth. So we'd love to know about correlations with media systems across the states. Are you examining that?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And actually, that was in my initial proposal to Ken. It include media systems. The media, I think, is extremely important in this. This was, I did a political science conference. I was on a panel with a researcher who had looked at conservative radio stations, right, across the U.S. And she found that wherever there were more stations of conservative radios, there was actually tended to be more political violence in that region. So I think, if I could get a good database on that, or if I had more time to collect it, I think it definitely is not only amplification of hate, but it contributes to the kind of field of hate that I'm trying to get at here.
Thank you. Another question is, should religion be a factor?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big one. I think from what I've seen, I can't think of one religion that hasn't been kind of turned into some sort of utilitarian tool to exact either peaceful protest or hate. So I'm not seeing, I'm seeing it as more of, I've seen it in the past when I look at political violence before hate, which I study, even Buddhism, right? There are Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka who are violent. So I see it more as kind of an intervening variable, not a prime variable.
Thank you. Another question is, how does the index account for the locus of expression versus origination? For example, the Unite the Right rally took place in Virginia, but involved instigators from dozens of states. How would this be registered by the index? And would the Unite the Right rally be considered a single incident or multiple incidents?
Yeah, it's what I've drawn from the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. I think what we're seeing is hate groups are really acting upon what they see as kind of prime sites where they can get a lot of attention, right? And certainly Unite the Right rally was that. They knew they could kind of innervate not only local people, but people from around the country. This is true, though, of any sort of movement. The anti-globalization movement, at the turn of 2000, certainly WTO, people came from around the world, right? And Seattle's a progressive city, but it doesn't mean that's because it's progressive, right? And so I think there's a certain taking advantage of it. Certainly the Proud Boys and Gavin McInnes have done similar things in New York City. So it's hard. I try and process this all the time. There's a rally here, Portland. There's a lot of activity in Portland, but it's Antifa and it's hate group. So it's complicated. I'm still trying to parse that out as well.
Great, thank you. Next question is, can you say a bit more about whether voter ID laws and similar legislation that makes it harder to vote is an appropriate metric to consider when compiling the index?
Well, I think the yes, it would be my short answer, and the reason why is I think it certainly these laws are designed to be racist in general, and there's a long, I'm not making this up. There's a long history of these voter ID laws being used against people of color to disenfranchise them. So I do think it as an important metric and one that I want to start to incorporate in the next iteration of this.
Yeah, and if I could tag on to that, just to, because not all
Sure.
these laws are just on voter ID. I mean, some of them are about mail-in ballots, and some of them are on how what day of the week you get to vote. Is there a place where you can drop off your ballot? There are a whole variety of things in these laws. So I would agree with you that if you look at the voter ID laws, I mean, they're a manifestation of the same thing we saw back in 50, 60 years ago, where there were literacy tests and seven ways to block intentionally people of color from coming and vote. So I think I would agree with you that's appropriate. But there's a wide range of different states that have different laws on, for example, when you can get and how do you return your absentee ballot. And it's true that states like, Florida and Texas and others are making it more difficult to vote, but some of them may actually have more liberal laws than some of the states that would come up at the top of the list, right? So when I know it's going to be next year and you're thinking through all this stuff, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but how would you anticipate taking into consideration the things that are clearly designed to be discriminatory, and to deal with those things that may have other motives or may actually be more liberal than places where you're not having a change in voting laws?
Yeah, so I think what I would do is, and this would actually be collecting new data. This is not a database out there that we have, so it's a great opportunity. And I think what I would do is consult um, people who know the law, such as you, and can help me discern this kind of thing. So I think it's extremely important, as you say, to understand that nuance. And I certainly don't understand that nuance right now, but I would want to incorporate that nuance in there. And so I'd have to ask you, Ken, quite frankly.
We'd have to discuss. Uh, so anyways, next question is, I was very surprised to read an article or study asserting that African Americans are frequently arrested for committing hate crimes. And I was not surprised that the same study asserted they were sentenced more harshly. I don't know if these claims are accurate. Would you be able to gather any information about race or ethnicity of those who commit hate crimes and their victims?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I'd have to look. I haven't necessarily seen a database out there with that. That would be a huge task to collect on my own, but it would be interesting to look at for sure.
Thank you. Next question is, people with disabilities are underrepresented. Are there those who hide their invisible disabilities but not successfully, who are not providing feedback for a real conversation? Genetic disabilities, which are the obvious cause an individual to be avoided and somewhat hated. So I guess, is there a metric on disability that?
Yeah, this is another one of these areas where there needs to be way more work on it, right? So there is some in the laws and policies section from Levin and Nakashima. Pretty sure that they incorporate disabilities as one of their categories for laws, but it's completely, of course, underrepresented out in the world of hate studies, political science, as far as at the state level. And that would be, if somebody wants to start compiling that database, that would be terrific.
Okay, another question, in terms of reporting hate, what do you recommend the country needs police departments to do? What kind of data would be important to collect, since you did point out before that some of the data is missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there has to be kind of a greater social norm of being willing to classify a crime is a hate crime at the local level. It does get really hard. I don't, it's about changing a huge norm, not only within the policing system, I think, but across the country itself. It's really because when you start defining things, when you define things as hate, that's a huge deal. And when you define it as a hate crime, you're certainly putting a huge. You actually sometimes can have the potential to um, kind of over activate what's going on. So I don't really have a great answer for how you change kind of social norms like that. I have this
Right.
one little piece of the hate index that I'm hoping is going to like seep out and help that.
Right. No, I appreciate that. And just one thing to add for what it's worth, one of the, because I've worked with people with training about hate crimes, the problems are deep because even in places where where people want to report it, it's much more difficult for the cop on the beat and the desk sergeant to report a hate crime because there's a lot more paperwork than something that isn't. So there's a systemic push sometimes for the desk sergeant to say, don't classify it that way because we don't need the work. We want to get you back out. And those things need, some resources and training as well. So I agree with you. It's a challenge. Um, so a question again about policing: is there a correlation, I guess, with the rankings with policing? I don't know exactly what that question fully implies, but maybe did you see a correlation with places where policing tends to be more of an issue with places that rate lower or higher on your scale?
Yeah, I don't know really. I haven't looked that deeply at policing. I know that this has become a huge issue, and again, what data I've seen out there is just really started to be collected these last 2 years. The New York Times, Washington Post have teams of researchers collecting this kind of data, um, and even the call to other data on the police. It's really kind of not out there, so. I really don't have. I haven't incorporated it yet, and I don't know how I would do that at this point.
Okay. Another question is: are you familiar with the ADL's heat map, and how does that map compare with your work?
Yeah, I am. And the data that I pulled from the ADL actually helped create that heat map. I have not looked at the particular rankings in relationship to that heat map, but the data for that heat map is in this. So I'm sure there is some sort of correlation.
Great. Okay, the next question is: will you factor in migrations of various ethnic and racial minorities as contributed to the rise in the location's hate index standing? Could your existing findings be helpful to those agencies that are working with the relocated populations of immigrants within the US?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about actually looking at a map and see where migration flows are and see how states rank in comparison to that. That's a great idea.
Okay, thank you. And um, let's see, another one just reports a resource, a book, When Hate Groups March Down Main Street, Engaging Community Response, by Mark Bremen and Deborah Levine. So I want to mention that. Um, and there's one here I don't fully understand, but basically, let me read you some of it. It's long. So somebody who experiences racism: I have a problem with laws and policies being directed at somebody's definition of what racism is rather than behaviors, which, if directed at anybody, would be deeply problematic. Similarly, I find, quote, identity is problematic in the way it is being used, so that those who identify either become victims or aggressors rather than behavior being made the issue regarding whether you approve of it or not. Do you think identity, which is subjective, being used as a yardstick rather than behavior, which is objective, is undermining the cause for a more equitable society and actually making potential criminals of all of us, including good people?
Wow, so that's a huge kind of social philosophical question. I'd have to think more about that. I would shortchange it to give you a quick answer to that, but I definitely respect the problematizing of identity that you've put forth there, and I'll think about it.
And I would add, listen, correct me if I'm wrong, but from the index that you put together, it isn't, based on attitudes or how people think as much as concrete things, laws, groups, incidents, and so forth. So it is really either behavior or reflection of behavior that generates the data. I mean, you're not looking in this and measuring where somebody on a Pew, research study thinks about other people as much as data from things that are really on the ground. So, I think you do weigh towards things that could be seen as closer to behavioral than just identity, if I understood the question correctly.
Mm.
So another question, is it fair from a statistical perspective to not have data sets on hate against all different types of groups? I mean, you can make a conclusion on the level of hate against African Americans or Jews. Does it really matter if we don't have a data set on hate against other groups? Presumably a hate group hates most other non-white groups.
Um, so statistical perspective. So what I would say as a general of um, I'm trying to build a model, and you can only build a model with what you have. That model certainly has shortcomings, but at least from a social science point of view, you build the model, you refine it. Someone comes along and says this is a weakness. This needs to be strengthened. So, you know, I do think it's I do think it's important to have data in there on kind of hate against Asian Americans and have as much as possible, um, because I think that will change the model at times. So, is it statistically fair? I mean, I have what I have, and I'm making a model from that. And as I get more, I'll keep working on the model.
Yeah, but that raises another question. So, even if groups have different uh, people that they uh, target more than others. I think it's probably true that white supremacists don't like Jews, don't like people of color, all that. If you get more data, Asian incidents and other things, and you weigh them as separate entities, does that like double count in a way? Because part of what's interesting about what you put together is there is no like really set in stone way of how do you weigh one thing versus another thing. You had them in different categories, as you explained very well, but in terms of weighing them together, I mean, another example might be the number of hate groups. Sure, that's one thing, but not all hate groups are the same. Some are much more important than others. So the SPLC, either you're in or you're out. Some hate groups might have three people and somebody in the basement tweeting. Somebody might be able to bring together hundreds of people to threaten a public health official. So how do you weigh those things to make sure it isn't being overweighted by one type of issue?
Well, I mean, as I kind of go through the data and stuff, I have to make kind of judgment calls along the way whether or not to weight it, or to keep it as equal. And in some cases, if you look in the methodology, certain laws and policies are weighted more than others, and there is a weighting system used in some of these. Um, but it really depends. I'm making these kinds of determinations as I go along to see I'm looking for parsimony. The world's extremely complex, and if I can get parsimony as possible with my model, I think that's a good start. um, but the world's social dynamics, social political dynamics are extremely complicated. So I you give up some stuff and you gain other things in these kinds of models.
Great, thank you. So another question is regarding policing. Somebody recommends checking out the U.S. Institute of Peace special report, which is online, Lethal Ethnic Riots, which examines the research of A. Varshney and D. Rothschild in relation to hate-related riots and policing. This research is directly relevant to the discussion. I'm not familiar with it. I don't know if you are, Robert, but I figured I would.
Yeah, I've seen this, and actually, Varshney is a great scholar on ethnic conflict in political science. So I'm, you know, I'm boosting that pitch there to read that. It's extremely important.
So let me ask you, because we're obviously talking about the United States, and you've broken it down to, um, 51 units. Um, but we have at BARD, the Open Society University Network, the notice of the report and this webinar went out to colleagues in Vienna and London and parts of Africa and Berlin and elsewhere. Do you see this as a model that might be picked up outside of a country, like a geographic area, the EU, other places? And how do you think about how that might work or work differently?
Well, it's we're looking at in this the state level, not the country level, but I think a country comparison level, especially in Europe or Eastern Europe or any of these other countries. If you could start to have a comparison within certain regions, I think that would be an index that would be extremely valuable. Um, and I have to search around to see what statistics there are out there. There's certainly plenty of, unfortunately, hate groups and hate activities going on throughout Europe, in Eastern Europe. So yeah, I see it extremely useful.
Okay. And one of the things when I think about what that might look like, I mean, one of the differences between the U.S. And countries that have parliamentary systems is it's a lot easier for some of these countries to have groups that, if they were in the U.S., they would make the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate group classification actually have representation in the political sphere. So here, how is there a correlation or something with political rhetoric that might also be of interest? Because there are, even though there are no, I mean, one can argue about what's happening in some aspect of at least one major party in the U.S. at the moment, but there's a correlation in my mind with a lot of different things that happen, including not only hate groups and legislation, but political rhetoric and the demonization of others and giving the impetus to saying this is the type of effort that we should support. So I wonder if there's a way to sort of, if anybody classifies that type of political rhetoric and to be that as part of a metric, because that might actually give a disincentive to that type of speech demonizing others.
Yeah, certainly, and the very first proposal had not only as Emma brought up, but the media, but also had looking at political rhetoric and looking at politicians. I did not find a database out there, but certainly a content analysis over the years of the rhetoric of different politicians and starting to code that would be certainly great. We see that. I mean, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen political rhetoric just kind of go far outside the bounds of what it used to be, and leading to things such as January 6th. So I think it's extremely important to see what politicians say.
Great. Okay, so actually two questions, but I'll read them one at a time. One is, how do the results of this study help us deal with hate?
Well, I think recognizing that there are I think of it as a social force, not as an individual thing. So recognizing that there is something there that is hate as a social force, and not pushing it actually into the realm of evil. Because I think if you keep it at the level of hate, then you can actually start to deal with it, because we're talking about people's frustrations, people's aggression, and how they're allowed or prevented, from acting on those frustrations and aggressions. So I think, from my mind, doing something like this finds at least some trace of empirical existence for it. It's actually a real thing. It's not just people, an ideology. And I think that's, from a social scientist point of view, I think that's extremely important, because then you can start to figure out policies to help manage it, or actions, community actions, to help people kind of deflate this kind of aggression, frustration.
And I would add, at least from where I sit directing the center, there are two other really helpful things about this in terms of dealing with hate. One is that, as I said at the beginning, it's a new way of looking at it. It's a wider lens, and we hope that others, pick that up, figure out what all the data needs to be identified, and do similar analyses. I think the more of these, the better to see hate as a system, hate as a tied to a geography, just than looking narrowly at hate crimes or other sort of siloed things, but see them more as a system operating at the same time in the same space. So that's one thing. And then secondly, as I said, we're going to have a community organizing manual. We've got a lot of input from groups around the country that hate crime happens in their community, or there's discriminatory legislation, and they want to know, how do I form a group? How do I lobby? How do I do press releases? How do I do all these things? Like having the data, Robert, that you provide, that lets them look into not only what their state is and how it can be improved, but how it ranks with others, will give them a tool. I mean, I don't know, at the end of the day, is Montana going to be not number 50, but number 30. I don't know. I don't think any of us can say that, but I think this gives a tool to people in those communities to advocate for things that will reduce hate. At least that's our hope.
Mm.
So we're almost out of time. Let me ask one final question. Actually, it's just a comment. This is such a helpful examination and assessment of the different data, and how to think about what different resources mean, and importantly, what they don't tell us. So, Robert, pick up on that. What do you think that the data, doesn't tell us that you think is important for others to pick up on?
Well, it certainly doesn't answer the why question, why this is happening. I'm just kind of giving the, descriptive, wow, something's happening here. And something happening here is different than something happening here. But why it's happening state to state, and why there's variation, I don't have that answer yet. That's just the initial looking at the kind of partisan table, and regional thing is trying to dig in deeper than that. But, if someone can come up with the why, that would be great.
Well, let me add to that. And the way I look at what you've done is, to make an analogy to medicine, you've given us a thermometer. You can tell that there's a fever, there's a problem. You need more analysis to figure out what is it and how does it work and what should we do about it. And there's so many variables. So those of us who spent some time thinking about hate, there's so many variables: the politics, the culture, the identity, the power of ideas. I just read because I'm chairing a session at the Gonzaga Hate Studies Institute conference. I read a senior project by a Bard student who's actually now a postdoc, writing great things about understanding hate from Berlin. But in 2012, she wrote one on basically looking at the pleasure people get from inflicting pain on people that they hate. There's so many, aspects of this, and I don't think there's a simple answer. I don't think there ever is. I think there's a bunch of data points, a bunch of different analyses, and that's what we're trying to pull together at the center, is to say that there's a lot of really important and good work. Roberts is the latest example of it, but we want to put it together to help us figure out, just as we figure out when people are sick, you need a lot of different diagnostic tools to figure out what to do. When there are problems in society, that hatred allows people to be vilified and demonized and dehumanized. We did a bunch of tools, and we're glad to do our little bit of part. And I'm very pleased with Robert that your 2 years of labor worked out so well, and it's been so useful. And it's been a pleasure working with you. And I'm looking forward to the 22 version.
Okay. Me too. Thank you
Great.
very much, Ken. I appreciate
Great.
it.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. And everybody who registered will get a link tomorrow. And please share the report, and please share the webinar if you want with your friends and others who you may think would be interested in this. Anyway, take care. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.